This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 277 of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. This is the last of our Best in Beer Brewers Perspectives. And joining me for this last Tuesday Brewers Perspectives episode is Randy Booth, head brewer for Twin Barns in, is it Meredith, New Hampshire? Welcome to the podcast, Randy.
Thank you so much for having me.
On the shores of Lake Winnipesaukee up there in New Hampshire. You know, I used to mountain bike up there at Highland Mountain, great little mountain bike park, kind of Tilton area of New Hampshire. It's been a whole bunch of years, more than a decade since I've been up there, but cool area. We're going to talk to Randy. You've got some standout lagers that you've sent to us, and your Belknap Pils rated a 99 in the magazine and merited a spot as our favorite German Pilsner or German style Pilsner of 2022. We're going to talk about lager brewing with Randy. Before we do that, step into the modern era of brewing. AccuBrew presents a game-changing fermentation monitoring system, giving brewers unprecedented real-time insight into yeast health and activity. By simply mounting a sensor to a port, brewers get real-time information through the AccuBrew app, tracking sugar conversion, temperature, and clarity. And just one AccuBrew sensor protects every tank in the event of a glycol system failure. Get your hands on a tool that'll help you deliver your best brew every batch. AccuBrew has your back because it was designed for you, the brewer, by brewers. Visit accubrew.io today for a no-obligation 90-day trial. Also, this episode is brought to you by BSG, who invite you to get funky with Fermentis Soft Brew BR8, the first dry Brettanomyces bruxellensis culture available to brewers. BR8 offers the distinctive flavor of Brett Brux combined with the shelf stability and consistency of dry yeast. BR8 delivers fruity notes early on, but with aging, the base starts to slap as BR8 brings the funk. Visit bsgcraftbrewing.com to learn more. So, Randy, let's talk about Twin Barns and your personal arc through brewing. Walk me through that aha beer moment for you, and then how that translated into deciding to pursue brewing beer professionally, and then how that professional arc has carried through for you.
Sure. First of all, you said Winnipesaukee correctly, so that's how I knew you had some sort of relationship to New Hampshire, because nobody ever says that correctly if you've never been here. So well done there. My story, stop me if you've heard it before, but I was a home brewer. I was in college.
Yeah, never heard that one before.
I'm sure you
never heard that one before.
So I was in college and, drinking, the regular beer, the Budweisers of the world. Never really enjoyed it. And I remember drinking a Long Trail Ale and realizing that, wow, beer could taste good. Beer can have flavor. And that kind of sent me down that rabbit hole of just trying different craft beer, Long Trail, Harpoon, Rogue, a lot of the ones that I started drinking in college. But when I was in college, I was actually getting a degree in journalism. So that was my focus at that time. So I actually graduated college.
You're out going after pulling on our own heartstrings here.
Yep. And it's maybe it's a different story that you haven't heard on the podcast, but yeah, I went into the newspaper world, and that was right around, I graduated in 2009. So that was a bad time to graduate, looking for a job, especially in the newspaper field, because it wasn't quite a time where you could get a digital job. You could work online or anything like that. You really still had to work at the physical newspaper or magazine if you were lucky enough. And those things were tailing off. So worked as a sports writer, sports editor, and I actually worked as a sports editor kind of all over New Hampshire. But I was an editor in Laconia, oddly enough, right on Lake Winnipesaukee. And I remember at that point I started getting into homebrewing. And as a sports editor, you're there till you put the paper to bed. You're designing the pages and you're getting coaches to call you. So I remember sitting at my desk waiting for, a Winnisquam field hockey coach to call in with a score. And while I was waiting, I would read my homebrew book and whatever homebrewing things I could get my hands on. And I just knew at that point I was kind of in on beer and out on newspapers, as much as I still do love journalism. So I kind of had a quarter life crisis at that point. A couple of years later, I sold all my stuff. I had a friend and his girlfriend who was actually moving to Colorado so she could get her master's. And they asked me, they said, hey, you want to move to Colorado? And I was in a funk, and I was like, sure, let's do it. So that's when I sold everything, moved across the country to Colorado to try to get into the beer industry. Because in New Hampshire at that time, I want to say there was maybe 20, 25 breweries. Now we have more than 100. So it wasn't as readily available as it is today to get into the industry. Moved to Colorado. I remember emailing every brewery I could find in Colorado at that point. That was in the Fort Collins area, because she was going to school in that at Colorado State. And
sure.
So we
right here in our backyard in Fort Collins.
That's right. Yeah, I drank a lot of beers over at Tap and Handle and Mayor, and a lot of great spots in that area. But I knew I was going to be centered in Loveland. I emailed, I want to say 45 different breweries, and there was one brewery that actually emailed me back, and it was Wiley Roots in Greeley. And at that point, I just basically said, hey, I'm moving to Colorado. I want to get into the industry. And I remember Miranda Carbaugh, one of the owners, emailing me back, and she was like, essentially said, yeah, if you do show up in Colorado, sure, we'll give you an interview. I think it was a pity party for the most part. And then all of a sudden, 2 months later, I kind of show up and I email her and I say, hey, I'm here. And I kind of called her bluff and made her interview me. And I went through the 2 hardest interviews of my life with Miranda. And I got like a 15-hour-week taproom job, which was kind of crazy. But that's kind of where it all started. And I told those guys I would do whatever they wanted me to do. So I started in the tap room, and then very shortly after, I remember we lost our salesperson. So they said, hey, you want to try your hand at sales? They actually framed it as a competition. And I said, well, if it's competition, I'm in. And they gave me all the crappy territories. I was, Kyle Carbaugh, the owner brewer, had like Denver, and my good friend Skip, who's now at Weldworks, he took like Fort Collins, and every little town around it I got. And I was like, all right. So I just started selling beer, and I think they appreciated that, and was doing distribution. And I told them, I have a social media journalism background, so I can do anything there for them. And before I knew it, I was kind of doing whatever I could for those guys. And I just started getting into a small batch brewing at Wiley when a brewery in New Hampshire, Hobbs Brewing Company, I kind of knew the owners there. They reached out. We actually had a collab planned at Wiley, and I wasn't even at Wiley for a year when they came out. They were looking for a new brewer, and they offered me the job. And I spent less than a year in Colorado, but that sent me to back home to New Hampshire, where I was a head brewer at Hobbs, and kind of the rest is history there. So.
Sure. So at Hobbs, you actually, won 2 JBF medals in the farmhouse ale category. Yeah. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So we won a bronze in 17 and a silver in 18 for Classic Saison. And as a new brewer, I started at Hobbs in 2016. As a new brewer, I didn't know if I was making good beer. It's one of the hardest things. I'm sure, chefs battle this too, where you try something you make and you're like, oh, I think it's really good, but I see flaws, or is it that good? And then everybody blows smoke up your butt. So, you don't know if you can trust anybody's opinion on anything. So once we won that medal, it was kind of a moment where I realized we are making good beer. It gave some validity. Then when we won the silver, it's like, okay, now we know we're consistent and that we can duplicate it. And that was even a recipe, funny enough, that was the first recipe I wrote at Hobbs, the first commercial recipe I ever wrote. And then this Belknap Pils, which we'll talk about later, was the first recipe I wrote at Twin Barns. So I don't know if I store up energy and I spend it all in that first recipe, but that's kind of what I did there with Saison. So.
You peak early.
Yeah,
huh?
Yeah. And then you keep trying to go after it as you keep brewing and brewing. So, but that's what we did at Hobbs. And that really just solidified to me that we were on the right track and that, the beer was solid. And there's even tweaks between those two beers, the bronze and the silver winning beer. But, it just put me in the right motion that, we are making good beer.
And so then Twin Barns came along?
Yeah. So, I was at Hobbs for about 3 years. We actually did a lot of cool projects while I was the head brewer there. We were building a production facility. And we actually built a brewery in Belize. So if you look up Brewing in Belize, this was the first brewery outside of Belknap, which has been there for a long, long time, that opened up. So I was down in Belize a few times to build that brewery. I wrote the first, somebody might want to argue with me, but I wrote the first IPA recipe in Belize, the country of Belize, which is kind of cool. But it was at a time where a lot of other things were kind of going on. Twin Barns had just opened, but needed a brewer, and I actually went in there to help them transition because they had beer in the tanks, but they had no way to get the beer out of the tanks, and so they had to figure that all out. So I actually went in there. I've been on the board for the New Hampshire Brewers Association, so I try to give back as much as I can to anybody that needs help. And being only 35 minutes away, I jumped at the opportunity just to help these guys, and just being here, I was like, you know what, I would like this setting. I would like a different challenge. I would like a challenge that wasn't, Hobbs was becoming a production brewery, which is obviously, distribution and all that sort of thing, where Twin Barns is built on bringing people to the brewery and to the environment. And I kind of wanted that. I wanted to, instead of just brew anything I wanted to brew specific things and really try to nail them. And that's kind of where that German Pils fit in.
Well, I want to talk about that, Pils. Before we do that, balancing barley and hops is your expertise. Food-grade lubricants is theirs. When it comes to what you do, you're the expert. When it comes to supplying food-grade lubricants backed by service-oriented professionals, Clarion Lubricants are the experts. They'll work with you to create an efficient lubrication program that helps protect your operation. To learn more, visit clarionlubricants.com/food grade. Clarion Lubricants, the experts that experts trust. So yeah, Randy, and I should say, like, Belknap Pils being this German Pilsner that we have, included in our best 20 beers of 2022 wasn't the first lager that you sent to us. The Long Ridge lager the year before also had a good mid-90s and very impressive lager score. And so clearly there's a pattern of successful lager brewing, but it also sounds to me like you are a dogged researcher and someone who dives down trying to get the story. And I'm just getting into the metaphor there pretty hard.
Don't want to bury the lead.
So there it is. So, but talk to me about your process when it came to building a lager program and developing those first lager recipes.
Well, first and foremost, lager brewing at Twin Barns is difficult because it's not necessarily equipment or anything like that, but we're so busy in the summer. We're in a lake. We're a lake town. We're a tourist area where in the summer we flip tanks. We're only brewing ales in the summer because all my lagers are going to spend at least 6 weeks in the tank, and we just don't physically have the time or the capacity or the space to do that in the summer. So my lager brewing essentially kicks off with Oktoberfest every fall, and then I brew as many lagers as I can through the winter, and then I got to basically stop myself once we creep up on Memorial Day because once Memorial Day hits, we just get wildly busy. So I only have a small window of time to brew these beers, and that's the lager issues usually roll into the perfect timing where the beer is still tasting great in the can, and we can kind of send it out to you guys. But yeah, when it comes to brewing lager, I think simplicity is important. Like Belknap Pils has 2 malts, and it's 98% environment pilsner and 2% acidulated, so it's built off of essentially one phenomenal malt. And even though, we brew a kind of variety of pilsners and whatnot, environment Pils isn't necessarily always our go-to base malt either. I've played around with some different malts to make other things work. For example, like Long Ridge is the 4 malted Bohemian Pilsner from Environment. So, it's about letting those ingredients shine, getting great ingredients, and just kind of getting out of the way.
When you say, when you say make it work, that's curious to me. How do you define making it work? Especially when you're talking about malt in a lager and making some of these malt changes to achieve what you're looking for. As you start thinking about it, like, how does that picture of what you want to achieve come into being, and then how do you then evaluate and measure your own kind of, sensory or kind of technical performance of that against this idea that you have? What's that process like?
A lot of it is knowing your ingredient, at least to some extent, and then brewing it and just purely sensory after that, just understanding, okay, I know, Pilsner malt is going to give me this honey-like note. How much of that do I actually want in the final beer? To give you an example, we brew a Helles, and it was 100% 4 malted Bohemian Pilsner malt, and I love the beer, but at the end of the day, I was like, that's just too much of that malt. So the next time I brew it, I'm going to cut back on that malt, probably blend it with more of the straight Pilsner malt, and just basically when you have such limited ingredients, when you're not putting a bunch of stuff into your beer, you can really understand what each malt, each hop does for you. And that's one thing, like Belknap Pils, it's hopped with Saaz and Hallertauer Mittelfrüh. And the biggest thing over the life of that beer, it's changed over the last couple of years that we've been making it, is getting that right combination of Saaz and Hallertauer, how to balance that and blend that. And it's not just 50-50 one and the other. It's about putting it in there and then going, okay, we need more Saaz in this. We want a little bit more of that bite to it. Or maybe less Hallertau. You're trying to take a little bit of that earthy character out of it. So it's when you're only working with 4 or 5 ingredients total in a beer, I think you get a really good idea of what each brings to the table, and then it's fine tuning it and balancing it. Every beer I brew, whether it's a lager or hazy IPA or whatever it might be, I'm always looking for balance. I never want anything to kind of blow out anything else. And so to get that in something like Belknap Pils, the Saaz and Hallertau, they're prominent. Like, they're prominent in the end of that boil to give you that flavor, that aroma, to give you everything you want out of a German Pils. But you still need to be able to see the forest behind the trees and see that malt and see how that malt holds up to that hopping on that beer.
Sure. Now, of course, on top of all of that, you've got seasonal changes to these ingredients, and if you're only brewing in the winter season every year, it's harder and harder, versus some brewers, who can phase things in and gently move over season to season. You don't have, between hop harvest years, between the malt that you brought in, there are some that can blend through those things and make these transitions subtle. You obviously don't have that kind of piece to it. We can talk about that down the road, but I still want to kind of touch on this malt piece. When you think about it from a sensory perspective, how do you define that Weyermann Pils versus like the 4 malted Czech Bohemian Pilsner?
It's funny, as journalism in our background, and both of us, I can't always put words to some of the stuff I taste or I smell. There's when that Weyermann Pilsner, it's
Randy, you're a word guy.
I know, but
I need this from you. Come on.
I always tell people I'm a word guy on paper. I'm not a word guy verbally over the microphone. But the Weyermann Pils, I get that honey character from it, and I don't always want that in whatever I might be brewing. And that Bohemian Pilsner, and this is a terrible word, but it has this rustic character, maybe more of an earthy, crackery character to it that I really love, and it's 100% what we put in our Czech Pilsner, but it's not where I want to go with our German Pilsner, with the Belknap Pils. And then, like I said, with our Helles, that is a release every once in a while. It was 100%, and now it's going to be going down next time we ever brew it. It's going to cut a little bit, because while that character is great, I don't necessarily want it 100% of a Munich Helles. So
sure.
But a lot of it is just relying on those maltsters. Weyermann being one of the best. You got to rely on those maltsters to. Their job is to make great malted barley, and so we trust them to do it. And if I order their malt in July, or if I order it in February, and I know it's going to be solid. And I think that's why, you gotta order good ingredients. You got to trust your ingredients. And a lot of people, not really lagers, but I know there's brewers that say, okay, let's just get the cheapest 2-row for a beer. But at the end of the day, if your beer is balanced, you're gonna taste it one way or the other. So I always kind of put as much premium as I can on every ingredient, from the malt to the hops to the yeast.
We're talking about, fine tuning, and the difference between good and great, ingredients absolutely play a part in that. But technical process and being able to get the most out of those ingredients is also, and there are plenty of brewers that make good but not great beers using those same ingredients. And so figuring out what those small things are that help elevate that, that's what I want to keep diving into. Talk to me about, kind of mash strategy here. Tell me, what kind of brew house are you brewing on, and, what then, in terms of step mashing, decoction, et cetera, do you employ to try to get, move this malt character in the direction that you want it to go in?
So our brewery was not built for lager brewing. Not ideal, but that wasn't necessarily the vision when Twin Barns opened. So we're single infusion. That's one thing I've done over the years is I do try to dry out these beers. I love dry beers. I want them as dry as I can get them. We actually, this one clocked in about 147 degrees on that mash temp. So we're going dry. We can't step mash, we can't decoct, we can't do anything. So even more of a reason to buy the best ingredients you can and trust your ingredients. But that's essentially what we're doing. We're single infusion. We're getting as dry as possible. We're not trying to over mix a mash or anything like that. We're pretty gentle with it. We give it a nice long vorlauf, get that as clear as possible, and then we send it to the kettle. So we're not doing anything crazy. We're just confident in our process and our ingredients. And I think that's one of the biggest things when it comes to lager brewing, especially when you might not have all the bells and whistles.
Are there any kind of technical pieces on there, whether it's, trying to control hot side aeration, or a low oxygen type of thing? I mean, are there other pieces to that, or some of the fine things that you pay attention to on that mash side? Obviously a nice long and gentle, vorlauf is something there, and a gentle mix, but are there some key points there that you find help make a difference in the overall quality?
For that one, obviously hitting your temp is super important. We are adding some calcium sulfate to the mash, once again, to kind of lean on that dryness side and focus on getting that as crisp as possible. A lot of it's just kind of taking our time and doing it right and not rushing the vorlauf. I know some people will vorlauf for 5 minutes and then they send it. This beer we vorlauf for at least 30 minutes, probably 35, depending on the beer. But yeah, we're just being gentle and being kind. We're trying to take care of the beer, so the beer takes care of us in the end, especially early on.
Yeah. Water's also obviously going to be a big component of this. And you just mentioned some water treatment there. Is there any other ways that you adjust this? Are you guys using is it reservoir water? Is it well water? What do you
we have beautiful water. There's a beautiful aquifer in the area. So we have some of the best water that you could possibly brew with. Very soft. So I don't do a lot when it comes to lagers. Every beer gets adjusted somehow or another. But I've just found with a lot of these lagers, I just need to hit it with a little bit of calcium sulfate, and depending on what I'm going for, but I'm going to hit it with a little calcium sulfate just to enhance it a little bit. But we have really nice clean water, even at Hobbs, which is only 45 minutes or 35 minutes away. Water was very lucky to brew that water. Honestly, if I moved to Manchester, New Hampshire, started brewing in Manchester, it would be a whole nother world, because just changing that water, not having that same water source would be kind of crazy. It would be difficult. It would be a learning curve to start off. You know what I mean? So we're lucky.
Or require some investment in additional equipment in order to,
Right.
Yeah.
So just having such a great blank canvas to start with, I think helps us for sure.
Sure. Well, let's talk, again about that, or get into this hot side boil, and then start talking about hops. And you mentioned getting the blend right. I imagine some of that's also an issue of getting the timing right through that process. Talk to me about, number one, what your bitterness goal is, and how you then shape the character, of that hop flavor on through that hot side addition.
Yeah, so we have a pretty vigorous boil. So that's one thing too. We only boil for 60 minutes. I know a lot of people with Pils malt are going to go to 90 minutes. I've honestly never seen a need to do it. I've certainly played around with it, but in our setting now, I stick to 60 minutes.
And no DMS issues from that.
Nothing that I've been able to taste through sensory or anything like that. Maybe I'm just lucky. But so we go 60 minutes there, real vigorous boil. We start with some Magnum just to get a nice layer of bitterness, clean bitterness in that beer. And I'm not doing that with every lager. That's one thing I've started to play around with more, is using low alpha hops early in the boil. But right now that Magnum, that super clean Magnum works for this beer, obviously. So I don't think I'm going to be changing that. And then, this is one of the few beers that we're adding a good chunk of hops middle of the boil. So 30 minutes we add Saaz and Hallertauer, and then right toward the end we're adding Saaz and Hallertauer. With such a vigorous boil, we do have issues with potential boilovers and that sort of thing. So the more I throw in the middle of that boil time, the more likely I might potentially have issues. But that is one that I make sure we get a good 30-minute addition. And then the blend at the end, the blend at basically Flame Out Whirlpool, it's a little bit more Saaz and Hallertauer, and it's not quite a pound per barrel in that Whirlpool, but it's fairly close. And then for hops like that, I think you're really extracting some really beautiful flavor. I think you're getting a really nice bitterness to that beer. But it's just a solid Pilsner. It makes you want to drink it, a few of them. And it makes you want to come back for more, and it keeps it crisp, which I think we all want in our lagers and our Pilsners. But yeah, that was the big thing early on, is I think I had more of an even blend in that beer. I think I had less hops toward the Flame Out. And now it's just, I sat with friends, other brewers, and that's the biggest thing learning in this industry, by the way, is having people you can trust that you can bounce ideas off of. But I remember talking to a buddy of mine, and we both kind of agreed, let's hit this with more hops at the end and see what happens. And it turned out that it just made it shine that much brighter. Once again, simple ingredients, timed right, get the right blend, and I'm happy with it.
So this 30-minute edition, it doesn't sound like that was something you were doing, when you started. What have you found that in particular, like, is there some, like, obviously we're talking about like very, very small impressions here and very, very slight shifts. But you've also at the same time changed the blend of those two hop varieties. How did you control for the variables as you made these changes? Again, knowing that you're only brewing this a couple of times each year and making these new, changes each season as you kick back into lager brewing. How are you measuring some of those changes? Then again, evaluating them, and what could you say that some of those small things are doing to the beer itself?
Well, I will say it's difficult because when I only brew Belknap, a couple times a year, hopefully.
Right.
You got to take good notes. I've been trying to get really good at taking notes on all these beers, especially when they go on tap. Really making note of the impression I'm getting, and then when I'm on those last couple kegs, I want to taste that as well to make sure to see how it's aged and see how it might have changed over time. But a lot of it's centered in just in trusting your gut, and knowing that when you brew and make these changes, you're like, okay, I'm buying the best ingredients. I'm trying to source the best Saaz and the best Hallertau, and this is, you can't take a lot back in brewing. You brew the beer, you give it your best shot, you lean on your experience, you lean on the ingredients, and you hope you make a great product. And you at the end of the day, or end of the batch life, when you're drinking that beer off tap, you say, okay, I get this note, but I want to change. I need to change it a little bit. Maybe it's a little bit too much of X and too little of Y. So at our scale, because we're only brewing about 1,000 barrels a year at this point, so we're not this brewery that's turning tanks every single day. We're super, and I would say 80% of that's between Memorial Day and Columbus Day. So it's we kind of go crazy for 6 months and then slow right down. But for that beer specifically, I think just those hops being in that boil for 30 minutes, those oils, you're getting different oils kind of coming through those hops. You're getting different experiences when it comes to the earthiness and the spiciness and the floral character from those hops specifically. So that was something that I think you can taste in the final product. And for me, I can only really do it side by side. Yeah. So
1 pound per barrel total for the hot side on those is
close. Total for a 10 barrel batch.
How does that split then between that 30-minute edition and the Whirlpool edition?
It's only a couple pounds, 2 pounds total at 30, and then we've got about 7-ish pounds in that Whirlpool. So, and it's a little bit more Saaz and Hallertauer. I should have looked up my original recipe to see how it compared to the latest recipe, but I do remember that being a change was trying to get a little bit, just changing that character a little bit. And I mean, I love Saaz. I know it's not traditional in a German pilsner. It's the exclusive hop in our Czech pilsner, the Long Ridge, but it gives you that character you want. And I think you want that noble spice character in a beer like this. And that's why it kind of edged out Hallertauer in this. And I use a lot of Hallertauer for other things. Each has their own place in different beers. But I just finding that balance was key over the last 3 years. Even though I can't brew it consistently for 3 years, I kind of have to rely on my notes and my gut and the sensory and say, okay, where do we go with this beer? How do we fine tune it? And there's not a lot of with a lager, like I said, there's not a lot to fine tune. It really comes down to your process and your ingredients. And then after that, where are you putting hops? What time? For how long? Are you knocking it out fast enough? Are you obviously fermenting at the right temperature? So there's work to be done on that fine tune scale for sure.
Talk to me about this Whirlpool edition and, in terms of timing, temperature, the kind of, how long you let it stand and whatnot. I'm curious just how much contact at what kind of temperature it's taking here at the end so that you're not getting something that's overly fragrant or overly aromatic either.
Sure. So we kill the heat and we essentially, we start whirlpooling. We'll whirlpool those hops for about 25 minutes and we let it rest for about 10. So we don't cool it down at all. That's something I'm going to play with in the future when it comes to lagers. I do that with all our New England style IPAs. I do think that's a great thing for those beers. And I think it was actually one of your podcasts, somebody was talking about cooling the Whirlpool, I believe, for lagers. I think specifically Italian Pils. So I think I'm going to try that. But for this one, it's pretty simple. We're just adding it, spinning it for about 25, letting it rest for about 10. Every system's different. It's kind of funny thinking back when I left Hobbs and came to Twin Barns, how, I had a certain way I did everything at Hobbs. Then I come to Twin Barns and everything that I did is now backwards. And now I can't even remember what I did at Hobbs. So 3 years later. So it seems pretty standard to me. But yeah, and then we're just resting for 10. And then we're getting it in that tank as fast as possible and as cold as possible, which it's great that we brew lagers in the winter. But Oktoberfest specifically, it's sometimes tough to get it cold enough, fast enough.
So you move it fast rather than a gentle transfer at that point, and you're just trying to, get it in there cold.
Yeah, let's get it in there cold. For that beer specifically, we're knocking out about 50 degrees, and we ferment at about 52 degrees. And that, like I said, that is the nice thing about winters here in New Hampshire. I typically don't have a problem with that. I can go nice and fast. The Oktoberfest test my ability for sure. and then we're just giving it a bunch of oxygen. All the lagers are gonna get
all the Florida brewers are like, yeah, we can't.
I know, right? And
we can't chill down that fast.
And we have a 2-phase heat exchange as well. So we're pumping cold water, we're pumping glycol, we're doing everything we can to get these chilled. But yeah, the other thing is we give it a ton of oxygen too. I probably over oxygenate. If anybody if we were to compare notes with the average brewer, they'd probably say I over oxygenate, but I've got a pretty good system. It works out pretty well, and I get the results I want. So if I'm using a little bit more oxygen at the end of the day, I'm fine doing that. But I find those beers like having that much O2.
Sure. So talk to me about fermentation. I'm going to assume you're using cylinder conical tanks, since this is not a brewery that was built for that. Is there, in terms of geometry, what do those look like? And, what then, how do you then coax great results out of the lager yeast that you're fermenting with? Yeah,
we don't have any lagering tanks, unfortunately. Nothing fancy like that. As much as I wish we had room for it, we certainly do not. But yeah, we're so like I said, we're fermenting.
It's the beautiful thing about having these conversations with brewers about these phenomenal lagers they're now making in America, is that there's a lot of ways to get to the same result, and and I think that's one overarching narrative that we've been able to come across here, that it's not just what you have, it's how you use it.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I've had incredible lagers that had lagering tanks. I had incredible lagers that didn't. I've had incredible ones that step mash, that don't step mash, that decoct and don't decoct. So, there's more than one way to skin the cat when it comes to beer. And I think that's one of the great things about beer and lager brewing too. But yeah, so we don't have anything too crazy or too fancy. Like I said, we're knocking out 50, we're fermenting at 52. And, it takes its appropriate amount of time to ferment out. It takes a handful of days. And then, we give it a appropriate diacetyl rest just to be safe. I usually, I'll let the jackets go up about 10 degrees if they ever get there, but I just kind of turn the jackets off toward the end of fermentation. And then I think one of the things that I do that not everyone does is I do a slow crash on that tank. So I'll take it from, whatever, if it's at 55, we'll go down 2 degrees every single day until we hit 32. And then it lives in the tank for, at that point, at least another 3, 4, 5 weeks. So every from brew day to package day is at least 6 weeks, and then it's cold, obviously, for the majority of that. But that's one thing I've learned with lager brewing is you can taste that beer every day or every week, and there is a corner that these beers turn. The brewers that brew lagers at ale temperatures and say they get the same product, I don't know. I know it's possible. I know it's possible. I just haven't had a lot of great examples of that. So I do believe in fermenting cold, getting the beer cold slowly. You don't want to shock the yeast, and then just letting it sit cold. And yeah, it might be week 5 and you taste it and you're like, yep, it's still rough around the edges, and all of a sudden it's Monday morning, you come in and you're like, yeah, this is where it wants to be and where it needs to be. And then at that point for us, we move it to our bright tank. We have 1 bright tank. We have 6 fermenters and 1 bright tank. And so that bright tank is very active in the summertime, probably the hardest work in the brewery. We get that carved up and we get it packaged. We do a little bit of spooning here, but it's honestly a part of my resume that I haven't perfected or mastered yet. I keep working on it, but I haven't. I'm still trying to figure that process out where I'm comfortable doing it every single time and get really, really good results every single time. So, what
does that mean? What are some of the challenges that you face while spooning?
A lot of the challenges is just knowing when to cap your tank and get that valve on there, and then going from there, treating it and making sure that your pressure is appropriate. And then getting that beer to your bright or packaged without too much breakout or anything like that. We do a really good job with dissolved oxygen. It's one of those things where small brewery, once again, we don't have a DO meter, but we've had DO meters in the building testing a lot of our beers. So we do a lot of work to keep oxygen out, and I think that's another one thing. We might do too much of that, maybe. But at the end of the day, we have really good canned beers that are 5-6 months old, because I think we take that extra effort to make sure we eliminate oxygen from the process. But yeah, spooning is something where I feel like I do it well one day, and then the next time I'm like, oh, screwed that one up. But I only get so many shots because brewing lagers in the winter, I only brew maybe 5 or 6 in the winter. So those are my shots. And if you miss that window, if you're sick to work one day, can't make it in, can't throw that valve on, or say that lager wanted it on a Sunday and can't make it in on Sunday, then you kind of
you missed your window, and that's that.
Yep. So it's one of those things where it's a blind spot in my game that I want to keep working on, and I do think that matters in some of these beers for sure, when you can get some of that carbonation like that and you don't have to top it off as much. But once again, I think at the end of the day, if you go through the right process to keep the oxygen out and treat those beers well, you can carb it up and still get a nice mouthfeel and still get a really nice beer.
If you are in a batch where it has worked out for you versus a batch where you missed that window, how do would you describe the beers differently, or is it noticeable in a sensory perspective? Now, of course, you're never really tasting them side by side because there are different ages on each. If you were to even try to do something like that, but in terms of plumbing into your memory there, any differences that you might define that way for yourself that would drive you to want to be better at spunding?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure other brewers are like this, where I will taste something and I see it, I need to do a thing a certain way to achieve it, and then somebody else standing right next to me is like, "Why are you losing your mind about that? Like, I can't taste it. I can't understand." And you kind of do have to think of it from that perspective, from like the consumer perspective, that they might not notice one batch of pills that's spooned and the next one isn't. But man, they do make great beers when you do it right. It's a mouthfeel thing. It's the tightness of those bubbles, or the head and that sort of thing. So I think it adds up, but it's one of those things you don't miss it until you have it. You don't realize you need it until it's not there, and you're like, oh, this really is the thing that might separate beers. And I think great lagers, when we're talking about beers with 4 or 5 ingredients, when you can top it off with something as subtle as that, that can make the difference. Say in an issue of your magazine, it could be a 89 or it could be a 99 if you nail that portion of it. So it's something we're working on it. It's we'll get there.
Sure. You never mentioned what yeast you ferment with.
So I'm using the Omega German 1 lager strain now. It's super versatile. It's clean. It doesn't throw out a ton of sulfur. I don't like a ton of sulfur in my lagers, but I love working with Omega. They've everything I've asked from them, they've been phenomenal. So their lager strain's great, and it's, like I said, it's versatile. So we use that as much as we can. We've used it in our Czech Pils. We've used it in our Dunkel. We use it in our Oktoberfest. It's just a great strain that can kind of do everything.
Sure. Let's talk about your the points of difference for your Czech style pale lager. Obviously, malt is a big piece there. What are some of the other elements? And I guess I should couch this in saying it's always interesting for us to see how brewers define these beers. More often than not, we'll find brewers call something their Czech style lager because it's brewed with Czech ingredients. Not that it necessarily reflects or tastes like an actual Czech style pale lager. And the same kind of thing with German, which is just generally means, in this kind of shorthand, just sharper bitterness. How do you then think about using these kind of schools of lager brewing and making something compelling in each of those that are different from each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. Especially brewing pilsner, and when you're brewing a Czech versus a German, one of the toughest things is just education for your staff, for your bartenders. It's to explain the subtle differences between a Czech style pilsner and a German pilsner. I think you get a lot of glazed over looks potentially from your staff. So you got to kind of hit some key points so they can understand it and then they can sell it to the customer. Maybe it's a selfish thing. Maybe we shouldn't have a Czech Pils on at the same time we have a German Pils on, but it's kind of what I want to do. It's what I want to drink. And then we do have people for whatever reason, even though both beers are quite hoppy and they're similar beers. We have people that, go crazy for the Long Ridge, and then we have other people that go crazy for this Belknap. But yeah, the Czech style is a lot like this, but stripped down even more. It's 100% floor malted Bohemian Pilsner malt, and then it's 100% Saaz, and it's going off memory here, but I want to say there's even more Saaz total hopping in that beer versus this beer. So obviously this one is a Saaz and Hallertauer, where that one's just Saaz, but it's even more Saaz, where that's prominent, where you're really tasting that beautiful Saaz, Czech Saaz character. And then you've got that malt, like I said, rustic. I don't know why. It's a word that always sticks in my mind about that malt. Get that rustic character of that beer, and I'm happy because we just packaged it last week, so we've got that fresh here for the next little bit. But it's just,
I use the word toothy a lot to describe it because it just has I wouldn't call it grainy or husky, but it just has this. There's like this mid-tone to it, like, punchy mids that, where some of the German Pilsner just kind of, doesn't hold up, quite as much in those mid-tones, to use an audio analogy around that. There's just that, or that into that like mid-tone into the upper bass register there. There's just something that seems more full about the, that Bohemian floor malt.
Yeah, it's like I said, I wish I was a better verbal wordsmith here. But I think that's a great way to look at it. I love the malt. It's a beautiful malt. It has its time and place, just like anything else. And once you understand these ingredients, once you brew with them and really understand them well, I think that's the difference between making good beer and great beer, is because you can then dissect it and start playing around with those percentages and understanding what you're doing with these things. Like I said, Environment Pilsner is a beautiful, beautiful malt. Sometimes I don't want that much honey character. We do a corn lager. So we have New Hampshire Bike Week. It is one of the biggest bike rallies in America. It's right down the road. It's actually the 100th year of it coming up next year. But we do a corn lager for it. And that's actually a beer brewed with entirely New England grown malt. So while Environment Pils would be beautiful in that beer, I don't want as much honey character in that. I want more corn coming out. So we actually use a really nice Pils malt from Maine Malt House in that beer. But it's not as, let's say, rustic as Bohemian Pilsner, but it has a really nice lighter honey note than the Pils. Really clean, slightly kind of crackery, but a really great malt, and it fits that beer perfectly. Every malt has a time and a place. Just a matter of getting comfortable with them and just figuring out where you want to go at the end result.
How does something like Maine, Pilsner malt from a craft maltster work in a technical way compared to some of the continental malts that you're also brewing lager with?
So we brew that corn lager once a year for Bike Week. So I don't handle it as much. I do handle it in some other beers, but sometimes you just got to go in anticipating, your numbers to be a little different, your efficiency to be a little different. It's always nice to have an extra bag or two on hand just to understand, what you're working with. And sometimes, consistency isn't necessarily, they're not 100% consistent, these craft maltsters, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Because I think as a brewer, you're going to get damn close to what you're going to try to do. And if it's off a little bit, at the end of the day, you're still going to get fantastic malt and you're still going to get a great character from that malt. So it might be off a little bit, but you're still achieving, I think, at the end of the day, your flavors. And your efficiency might be off a couple points, but there's some workarounds on that. So technically, with the really good craft maltsters, like Maine Malt House is a great example. You're not missing anything. You might lose a couple efficiency points, but you're getting a really great local craft malt that you can also tell a story with, which is, I think, beer is about, I always say beer isn't about beer is about people. And so when you can tell the story about local malt and local hops and that sort of thing, it's just another way to get your beer in front of people and have them enjoy it.
Back to your journalism roots, you're telling the story, aren't you?
That's right.
Are there any other lagers that you've been playing with and developing over the years? You mentioned Oktoberfest. Are there any others that find their way into your brew schedule in that winter time off season window for brewing lager?
Yeah, so we actually do a Dunkel, which it's kind of has a cult following. I was actually doing a beer fest in Vermont. And Vermont's our neighbor, but like obviously crossing state lines is difficult beer wise, but we had a little fest that we were able to do. I had somebody come up to me in Vermont asking about this beer, and we're not anywhere close. And it's a beer that we literally do 30 cases of out of a 10-barrel batch once a year. I had people asking when Dunkel's going to come out. It's a little 4.2% Dunkel, really just full of flavor, delicious beer. So it has a cult following. Side note on that beer real quick. This summer, like I said, we brew a ton of beer. I wanted to experiment with that beer. I can't brew Dunkel in the summer because obviously it's going to be in a tank 6 weeks, 7 weeks. Can't do that. So I took that same exact recipe and I actually swapped the yeast for an ale yeast, and we called it Dunk Ale, rim shot. But I wanted to see, if you take those same ingredients and you swap the yeast, what would you get out of it? And it's so weird. Dunkel is a cult favorite, and we don't sell a lot of dark beer here, oddly enough. But we put the Dunk Ale on, and we told everybody it's an ale yeast, and they drank it up and they loved it. They loved the little 4.2% light dark beer. I coined it an American Dark Mild because that was the best way I could describe it. So maybe that might be the next trend in one of your magazines is the American Dark Mild.
American Dark
Mild. But yeah, it's got a little cult following, the Dunkel, and now the Dunk Ale, which I think will come back as a different beer next year. So that's when we always do. Long Ridge is back, our Czech Pils. And then we're new one this year. We're going to be brewing an Italian Pilsner. So that's a style that's kind of intrigued me for years now. And like I said, I think it was on 1 year podcast where they started talking about a couple different techniques when it comes to hopping those beers that I think I'm going to give it a go. And then that kind of leads us right to the beginning of summer. Actually Vienna Lager. We do a Vienna Lager as well. And that one's quite rustic as well. Another like 4.3%. It's just a little dry Vienna Lager. That's also popular. But yeah, that leads us to summertime where we then we'll brew 20 barrels of our Open Road, our corn lager, and then that sets us up for about a month of summer and bike week, and then we're into IPA and light beer territory for about 4 or 5 months. So
cool. Well, any final takeaways on stuff that you think makes a difference in these beers? And any of those the small things maybe that we haven't talked about where you're like, this, I think, is probably a difference maker.
The biggest thing is ingredients. Treating those ingredients right, and then with lagers, it comes down to time. I don't think me personally as a brewer, I don't think there's any way to take any shortcuts with these beers. Like I said before, I've had lagers that were, fermented and packaged in 10 days, and people say, "Oh yeah, you can't taste the difference." I think if you're doing things the traditional way, you're using traditional ingredients. I think you need time. Time is such an important ingredient when it comes to lager brewing. And like I said, if you taste the beer on week 5 and it's not ready, and 6 it's not ready, and 7 it's not ready, then it's not ready, and you just keep it in the tank. And that's where we benefit is, in the winter I can leave them in the tank for an extra week or two if I want to. But time, quality ingredients, and take a couple chances here and there. Like I think the next evolution for us is really nailing down where we're getting our Saaz from, where we're getting our Hallertauer from. So we know what hops we like and where we like them, but who do we acquire them from? Who can get us really, really good lots of those hops so we can really fine tune these beers? And I think once again, that's something that can make a beer from really good to great. And it's just that little fine tuning, time and fine tuning.
Keep putting the work in. That's a great place to bring this to a close. AccuBrew is an analytical tool designed to collect and compare the information brewers need to produce consistent results. Fermentus Soft Brew BR8 is the first dry Brett Brux culture available to brewers. And when it comes to supplying food-grade lubricants backed by service-oriented professionals, Clarion Lubricants are the experts. As we enter this holiday season, don't forget that subscriptions to Craft Beer and Brewing are a great gift for those fellow brewers in your life. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, give a gift to somebody who matters to you, and help us make a difference at the same exact time. Randy, if people want to learn more about Twin Barns, the beers you make, or even come visit you, where do they find you all?
Yeah, so online, you can visit us, Instagram, Facebook, all those good things. We actually have multiple accounts now because we just opened a new tap room up in North Woodstock, New Hampshire. Which doesn't sound impressive if you're in California or Colorado or anything, but we actually just passed a law in New Hampshire last year to allow for satellite tap rooms. And we were the first brewery in the state to get lucky enough to take advantage of it. So we opened that on Columbus Day. So we've got a tap room up there, which is right near Ski Mountain. So our winters are going to get busier. I'm hoping that doesn't take my lager brewing away from me. So you can come visit us in North Woodstock, or you can come to the original Twin Barns, and we're at 194 Daniel Webster Highway in Meredith, New Hampshire, right on the shores of Lake Winnipesaukee.
Randy, thanks for joining me for the podcast. Thanks for sharing some of your thoughts on lager brewing. Thanks for making some really compelling lagers that are standing out amongst a crowded field of great lagers with our blind review panel. And thanks for talking with me. Cheers.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.